Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with Berlioz, Essential Works for Beginners. Now, Berlioz is one of those composers who takes some getting used to if you're a beginner, because his style was so personal. He was a wild-eyed, crazy romantic who wrote pieces that were unlike anything anybody else had encountered before. Really an amazing character. His main, let's say, his main decades of operation ran from the 1830s to his death in the 1860s. So it's just about 30 years. But in that time, he managed to compose an amazing amount of really extraordinary music and almost entirely major works. There are lots of short little songs and sniglets and other things, but Berlioz is known for writing big, huge, romantic, grandiose pieces. But at the same time that he was expanding music in every possible direction, his orchestration was extraordinary. He really invented the modern orchestra. He wrote the definitive treatise on orchestration, which was later added to by Richard Strauss. But he wrote it, the Grand Traité d'Orchestration, d'Instrumentation, whatever it's called. It's huge, and it's fascinating to read. It really is. He had just this incredible sense of fantasy. His musical style was impulsive and neurotic and twitchy, and his basic timbral sensibility was high. In other words, he liked high-pitched instruments. His sonorities tend to be in the upper register. Even when he's writing lower stuff, there's sort of higher stuff up above it. His style is very, 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 well, like I said, it's personal, and you'll have to get used to it. Once you do, it's incredible, absolutely incredible. But for that reason, because it just sounds so extraordinary, his feeling for sound was like no other composer. I've made a list of works which sort of go in order if you're feeling a little bit intimidated by the guy, because it takes time to get into his music. Mostly you're dealing with lengthy pieces and big pieces and vocal pieces in French. So if any of those things are a little bit intimidating or off-putting, take it slowly and go in the order that I suggested. If, on the other hand, you just want to dive right in, then by all means, dive right in. So let's start with the Corsair Overture. Now, it's an overture. It's easy to deal with. It's 8 minutes long, 9 minutes long on average. A Corsair is a pirate, and that's what the overture is about. It's a sea piece. It's about being out on the open ocean. It's extraordinary. It begins with one of a typical Berlioz gesture, a really fast, really syncopated, sort of woodwind fanfare that sounds just like a sea breeze. The violins whirling up and down as fast as they can, with the woodwinds going with the violins. It's amazing. Then comes a beautiful lyrical tune to get the orchestra going. A lot of Berlioz overtures start that way, by the way, with a fast initial gesture, then a lyrical theme, and then the main body, the allegro section, the quick section, gets hopping. And once it gets hopping to this wonderful salty sea tune, as Tovey called it, a salty, breezy, ya da 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 da. I can't do it. It's a big, long tune that ranges over just like octaves. Let me see if I can. And it does that. So it's up and down and up and down. It goes over just this enormous range, and that's typical Berlioz. It really is. It's a tune that never sounds the same way twice, and he never plays it exactly the same way twice. And it all builds to this enormous climax. It's just brilliant and fun. And give yourself 8 minutes or 9 minutes of pure enjoyment and listen to the Corsair Overture. And it has like all of his essential characteristics to it. The long-limbed lyrical melodies, the twitchy, crazy, rhythmically intricate thing at the beginning, the really cool tune underneath with the brilliant orchestration, the gleaming high pitch of all the instruments. Oh, it's just extraordinary. And that will get you into it. After the Corsair Overture, my recommendation. Oh, and if you like the Corsair, of course, there's like 4 or 5 other overtures. There's Roman Carnival, there's Benvenuto Cellini, there's King Lear, there's Les Francs Juges. It's a whole bunch of them that you can have some fun with. But then after that, Harold in Italy. Now, I know you're going to say, if you know anything about Berlioz, what about the Symphonie Fantastique? Isn't that his most famous piece? And the answer is yes. But it isn't really his easiest piece to get into. It really isn't. I mean, there's something. It takes a little doing. I mean, the last 2 movements are easy to get into. The rest of it a little less so. So we're going to get there in a minute. But first, I would go with Harold in Italy. Now, Harold in Italy is a symphonie concertante. That is a symphony with a concerto element for a solo instrument. The solo instrument in this case is the solo viola, which represents Harold. What Harold was doing in Italy is anybody's guess, because the story that inspired Berlioz to Harold in Italy was, I think, Lord Byron or one of those people, Childe Harold's Pilgrimage or whatever it was called. Basically, there is nothing in that poem that we hear in Harold in Italy. The fascinating thing about Berlioz is that whatever his literary sources, he inevitably shaped them to his own purposes and let the music dictate the story, not the other way around necessarily, not always. And in Harold in Italy, you've got a 4-movement symphony that has a beautiful opening movement where we get to meet Harold in a lovely theme for solo viola, and then a normal allegro movement in traditional classical form, sonata form as it's known. Then you've got 2 intermezzo-like movements. A beautiful slow movement that's actually a march, the March of the Pilgrims. It's a religious procession with a constant march rhythm and a bell sound in the orchestra behind it. It's not actually a bell there. It's like a harp and a thing going bong like this. It's lovely and beautiful and serene, and it approaches and recedes. Then there's a serenade in the Abruzzi, which is an Italian dance-type serenade with bagpipes puffing along. If you know the first movement of Beethoven's 7th, you may recognize Berlioz sort of taking a hint or two from Beethoven's symphony, and it's just deliciously charming. And then the orgy of brigands being, of course, bandits. And there's an orgy of brigands, and they have a huge orgy, and Harold is attending the orgy, and he sort of wakes up towards the end of the orgy and decides that life is miserable, and he dies. And the orgy continues on without him to a brilliant orgiastic conclusion. It's really fun. And the opening of the orgy is another one of those crazy Berlioz tunes. Dum da dum da 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 dum da 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 da. But it's like that. I did it all wrong, but you get a sense of it. It's another one of those tunes that covers just this enormous range of pitches. It has a huge range, and it's rhythmically very tricky, and it's off kilter. A lot of Berlioz sounds decidedly off-kilter in an exciting way. It keeps you listening compulsively forward. So once you know Harold in Italy, which lasts about 40 minutes or so, you are ready for the Symphonie Fantastique. Now, the Symphonie Fantastique is as famous for what it's about as the actual music, as for what it sounds like. Because what it is about is a drug trip of an artist who's in love with a femme fatale, and she dumps him, and so he takes heroin trying to kill himself, and he has or LSD or something, morphine, whatever they had in those days, opium, and he has a series of hallucinations in which she appears as an idée fixe, actually, a fixed idea. And she has a tune, and the tune is do 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 do. As you can tell, it's another one of those wide-ranging tunes. It goes all over the place, but once you get it into your head, it gets stuck there, and you hear it in the first movement. And then in the second movement, he's at a ball, a beautiful ball with luscious harps wonging along, four of them, actually, if you can do it. It's extraordinary. And then there's a scene in the country, which is the toughest movement to get through because it's about 15 or 16 minutes long. And it's very still. It's really, really still and very spare and kind of empty. It's music of great solitude and emptiness. But even there, in the midst of the solitude, the theme, the idée fixe, appears. And then it rises to an impassioned climax, after which there is the sound of distant thunder and shepherds calling to each other on an oboe and an English horn back and forth. And it's incredibly poetic. But that incredible stillness is as revolutionary as any of the wild things that come later in this symphony. It's a remarkable essay in static harmony, a static scene. And that's hard. It's hard to listen to for that reason. It takes a lot of concentration, and I there's no reason to sort of gild the lily there. You should know what's coming and appreciate it for what it is, because it really is an extraordinary essay in nature poetry. Then comes the march to the scaffold. The hero of the Symphonie Fantastique has murdered his beloved, and he's going to be beheaded. And so he's marching to the scaffold to get guillotined, and he does get guillotined. He has a last thought of his beloved on the clarinet, do 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 da 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 da, like that, and then chunk, and then the head falls off, plunk plunk, with the double basses into a basket. I mean, it's as graphic and repulsive as anything you'll ever hear in your life if you know really what he's doing, because it's completely illustrative. And then in the last movement, we have the dream of a witch's Sabbath, because even though he's dead, he's still having hallucinations, and she shows up on her broomstick as a hideous witch. And you hear the wonderful tune of the E-flat clarinet with burbly bassoons going, and then they have a witch's Sabbath to the tune of the Dies Irae. Da 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 da. The tune from the Requiem Mass about the Day of Judgment, and the evil demons and witchy things make fun of that tune, going do 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 do, like that. And then there's this big combination of the Dies Irae and the music of the witch's Sabbath, and it all turns into this really, really hot, broiling, orgiastic thing that drives the symphony to the end. Now, there's actually a sequel, believe it or not, to the Symphonie Fantastique. It's called Lelio, The Return to Life, which you don't need to get to until you're really getting into Berlioz, because that's a collection of all kinds of weird stuff. It's including melodramas, spoken dialogue and stuff, all kinds of strange things happening. I would wait to get to Lelio. But the Symphonie Fantastique, one of the most amazing things about it is that it was composed only 2 years or so after the death of Beethoven, around 1830-ish, 30, 31, 29, 30, 31, when Berlioz was working on it. And when you listen to it, listen to any Beethoven symphony, and then listen to the Symphonie Fantastique, and you realize Romanticism has arrived. We are in a different universe. The entire conception of the orchestra and sound of the orchestra is completely different. It's written for an enormous orchestra, a really huge orchestra with, 4 bassoons and 2 tubas and percussion and 4 timpanists playing 2 sets of timpani or more, depending on what Berlioz wants to do with them, and 4 harps. And like I said, it's an entirely different universe from what Beethoven was doing. And Beethoven was one of Berlioz's gods. I mean, he felt he was following in the steps of Beethoven, as did just about everybody who came after him one way or another. And so it is a remarkable, remarkable and revolutionary work. Certainly something that you must hear, but you don't have to hear it right away, unless what I've told you is so intriguing that you decide to plonk it on right away, in which case go right ahead and see what you make of it. That's part of the fun of it too. So after that, we have to deal with some of his big choral and vocal pieces, of which that's really the majority of his output, to be honest with you. There's a whole bunch of them, and operas and opera-like pieces, dramatic symphony, Romeo and Juliet with chorus and soloists and all kinds of things going on. Start with the Damnation of Faust, First of all, it's a great story. Most people know the story of the Damnation of Faust, right? Faust is an elderly genius science guy who's bored with life, so he makes a deal with the devil to restore his youthful vigor and run around, sowing his wild oats. Eventually, the devil comes calling for Faust's soul to, make do on his bargain. Faust falls in love with Marguerite, this lovely girl who he ruins, and it's in Goethe, the great German poet's Faust story, you get sort of the most expansive version of the legend. There's a zillion versions of the legend and a zillion different plays based on it, but the most famous one is Goethe. Now, in Berlioz's, Faust gets damned. He gets sucked into hell in one of the most entertaining choral scenes you'll ever heard, the scene in Pandemonium. He rides to the abyss on this little horse, and he sees demons and things appearing, and Satan, the earth opens up, and he gets sucked down to a bunch of hellish demons screaming in this nonsense language that's supposed to be the language of hell. And it's just more fun than you have any right to have. And then at the very end, the finale in heaven, Marguerite's soul, the woman he ruined, she rises to heaven, but he gets stuck in hell. Now, of course, in Goethe's story, Faust is redeemed at the end. Berlioz doesn't have anything to do with that. He has much more fun just leaving him like rot in hell. And so he does his own version of the story, which is perfectly legitimate. And there are 4 different acts, and it has all kinds of orchestral bits like the Hungarian march that everybody knows. A lot of other things like that. And the 4 parts are all of reasonable length. The thing is about 2 hours long, roughly, in 4 parts. So you can take it in bits. And, oh, God, it's fun. It has wonderful solo numbers and arias, fabulous choruses, crazy scenes of all kinds for Satan, who gets to sing the song of the flea and, all kinds of little satanic doodads. You'll have fun. You'll just have a good time with it. And after that, we're going to go for broke. The most important and largest of all of Berlioz's works, his opera Les Troyens, the Trojans. It's the Iliad and the Odyssey. It's the Iliad. It's the story of the Trojan Wars, right? The Trojan horse. The Trojan horse, right? It's in there. First couple acts involve the Trojan horse. The next couple acts involve the Trojans going to Carthage before they finally wind up in Italy and found Rome. They found the Roman Empire at the end of the whole deal. And there you get, the second part, you get the story of Dido and Aeneas from Purcell's opera of the same title. The queen of Carthage, Dido, falls in love with Aeneas, who abandons her, of course. And it is an amazing work, a glorious work, a misunderstood work for years and years and years. Berlioz could never get it produced. It was simply too big and too complex for the operatic stage of the day, and too serious, too effective a telling of the story. And it required a huge cast. And of course, after the Trojan acts, the first couple acts, everybody changes. They're all different. Aeneas is around, but everybody else is not around. But essentially, it becomes rather complicated, extremely complicated, but no problem for modern audiences. But it is about 4 hours long, maybe a little longer. It's as long as a Wagner opera, a big Wagner opera. And it moves much faster than your typical Wagner opera. It's full of glorious, glorious scenes, fabulous, exciting scenes. And it's another piece that you can take in bits. It has a huge symphonic poem in the middle of it, the Royal Hunt and Storm, where Dido and Aeneas all go hunting and there's a storm. It's lots of fun. Lots of things in there. And so if you know Berlioz, if you like Berlioz, if you think you're going to like Berlioz, just go for Les Troyens and listen to it for the Trojans. It's amazing. It's an absolutely amazing work. I saw it several times at the Metropolitan Opera. It was just thrilling. Some of the most thrilling evenings of opera I've ever seen. And it's been very well recorded also, by the way. So it's easy to get a good recording of it. You can get the Colin Davis recording. The Charles Dutoit is pretty good. Colin Davis did it twice. Get either one of them, and you're in business. Very, very simple. However, it doesn't end there, because Berlioz was not in his lifetime successful entirely as a composer. He wrote music criticism. He wrote one of the most wonderful books of memoirs that anybody ever wrote. He was a great writer, a fabulous writer on music, and funny, really funny and sardonic. One of the best stories, actually, about Berlioz it's in his memoirs, is that he was friends with Mendelssohn when he won the Prix de Rome. When you won the Prix de Rome, you got to go to the villa whatever in Rome, and you were supposed to write music and send it back to France. It was like it's like a scholarship. So he was in Italy, and Mendelssohn was wealthy, was doing his grand tour, and they ran into each other and they became friendly. And Mendelssohn was horrified by Berlioz. Mendelssohn was a devout, Lutheran, as only a converted Jew could be a devout Lutheran. And Berlioz was basically an agnostic or an, atheist. And they would have long theological discussions. And they were having a huge discussion about fate and predestination and all of these things. And they're walking down the Spanish Steps in Rome, and Mendelssohn fell. He slipped and he went tumbling down the steps and wound up on his butt. And Berlioz walks down to him and says, "Observe the workings of providence. I blaspheme and you fall." Well, Mendelssohn didn't think that was funny at all, but it was. And Berlioz, it's a great line, and, you get a sense of it. Anyway, Berlioz wrote a collection of essays called Evenings with the Orchestra, satirizing the standards of provincial opera houses of the day. And the basic concept of this little book is that there is an opera house somewhere in Europe where the band is so bored playing second-rate operas under second-rate conductors and having just second-rate musical experiences that as the performance goes on, a bunch of them stop playing their instruments entirely. Nobody notices. And they sit around and tell stories. And these are the stories they told. And so Berlioz has a series of evenings in which he is sitting in the pit. He has a friend and comes into the pit, and the conductor doesn't notice. And he just sits there and hangs out with these people and listens to them tell stories about the world of music. And it's hilarious. It's one of the funniest and most enjoyable books about music. And it's educational, too, because it says so much about the standards of music that obtained during the day, and Berlioz's own very sarcastic and elitist view of what was going on in his musical world. So if you enjoy the music, and whether or not you enjoy the music or not, frankly, whether you enjoy the music or not, thank you, let me get that straight, you will enjoy Evenings with the Orchestra. It's a book that everybody should read. If you care about music at all, it's just fantastically brilliant. And it says something about, the man himself, too, his feelings about music, his passions, which were extraordinary, and his frustrations as a composer who really never got any attention in France. In fact, he still doesn't get as much attention in France as he probably deserves. He was always better appreciated in Germany, actually. He was a good friend of Liszt. So, other people like that. And even Mendelssohn performed his Symphonie Fantastique in Leipzig, or allowed him to come and conduct it, even though they didn't have half of the instruments that he needed. So he was a force, and more of a force for the musical avant-garde in Germany of the day than in France. So everything about him is peculiar, but peculiar in the most intriguing and splendid way. And this is the list that will really get you started. I guarantee it. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks so much for joining me. Take care.